Hello, good morning, everybody. This is Abdulaziz Al-Muhayya from IP Academy. We are honored today to have Dr. Francis Gurry, the Director General of WIPO, to give us an interesting lecture about the global trends in IP. Dr. Francis holds a law degree from the University of Melbourne, a PhD from the University of Cambridge, and is honorary professor and holds honorary doctorates from universities in a wide range of countries. He is the author of a number of publications, one of which has become a standard legal text in the UK and is published by Oxford University Press as Gurry on Breach of Confidence. Before we start, I would like to note that we are going to mute all the participants to avoid any distraction. If you have any question, please kindly write it in the chat section or just raise a hand. And after the lecture, we will have 30 minutes to answer all of your questions. Okay, Dr. Francis, you may start.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your kind welcome and warmest greetings to all friends in the kingdom. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you. I'm only sorry that it can't take place in person, but I hope that will happen in the not too distant future. So I hope you're all well and thriving. And we all look forward to a return to normality. And my thanks to Dr. Abdulaziz, the CEO of the Saudi Authority for Intellectual Property, and my thanks also to the Saudi IP Academy of SIPE. It's a wonderful institution, so I'm very proud to be associated with both of them. Now, today I'm speaking about a topic which will involve a certain amount of crystal ball gazing, looking into the future. I'm going to start next, perhaps. I'm going to start with, please, the next slide. I'm going to start with some of the trends that I think are clear over recent years. I have a fair amount of slides on demand and geographical shift, and I'll speak about them in a moment. We can perhaps deal with them rather quickly, and I will leave the slide pack, of course, with the Academy, and you can consult them in a more leisurely, on a more leisurely basis. In many respects, I think some of the interesting challenges are, what are the consequences of these persistent trends that we've seen in recent years in the field of intellectual property? And what are some of the challenges or even threats, if you like, from a financial threat analysis point of view? Risks for the future would be a better word, that are coming out of this. So it's the second and the third part, I think, that really require us to think, about the direction of intellectual property and the direction and what that means for all of the actors in the field of intellectual property. So let's start with demand. The next slide, please. And here I'd like to show you, I hope that you can see the full screen, because what you see over a period of more than 100 years, about 130 years, and this is patent applications and dealing with the top filing officers, is that for almost 100 years, or more than 100 years, demand was rather flat in the field of intellectual property. And we take patents. Now, there is a slide, a similar slide for trademarks, and there is a similar slide for designs. And they come out in the same way. So for nearly 100 years, roughly the same demand for intellectual property. It was a specialized area, not a great deal of attention, either from the point of view of public policy or from the point of view of commercial enterprises, was paid to the area. But you see that starting in the 1970s or the 1980s in particular, you get this massive change in demand for intellectual property. And if you could show the next slide, please, you see that was patent applications. This is trademark applications. Something similar, perhaps starting a little bit later than patents. And the next slide, please. is designs. And you see, again, a similar situation. So what caused this? Well, I think three main things. One, of course, the knowledge economy, the value of intangible assets rising, investment in intangible assets in many economies outstripping investment in tangible assets, and a technology explosion, really, particularly in the area of information technology. And you're all familiar with the whole story there, but also in the biosciences and in many other areas, material sciences. So that has been one big driver, has been the knowledge economy. I think another big driver has been globalization. So we've seen that if you unpack the statistics, you see that applicants are filing for protection over a wider range. So with the wave of globalization that started perhaps in the 1980s, the latest wave of globalization, 80s, 90s, then the emphasis on free trade, open markets, that for a long time was the orthodoxy in certain countries, mainly the industrialized countries. Of course, over the course of the last 20 to 30 years, caused enterprises to seek protection for their intellectual assets in all of the markets in which they would be operating, and there were more of those markets. So I think these are the principal factors that we see behind this enormous rise in demand that we suddenly see starting in around about the 1980s. So if we could go to the next slide, please. The next slide, please. Thank you. Look, those last three slides were a long-term look, 100-year, 130-year look. Now, just in recent terms, let's look at the last 15 years, and you see the picture more closely, but you also see the market responsiveness of demand, because during the global financial crisis in 2009, you see a definite drop, and it's the same thing for trademarks. I won't go through the trademark and the design slides, which are the next two, but you can look at those. But persistently, worldwide, so the previous one was dealing with the top filing offices, the previous set, these is dealing with worldwide demand. And what you notice in the last 15 years is that the increase in demand outperforms the world economy. So it's a small measure, if you like, of the knowledge economy, that knowledge-intensive sectors have been outperforming the world economy in other respects. If we could go to the next slide, that's the same for trademarks, and the next one, the same for, the next one, please. The same for designs, and then let's go on to another one, because I would like to get through these. You can look at these at leisure. But now we've taken long-term demand, medium or last 15 years. Let's look at the year 2019 as a last incursion into this area of demand. And interestingly, you see a decline of 3% in number of patent applications worldwide, a rise in trademarks, a rise in designs, and plant variety protection also a rise as well. Now, when you unpack those figures, what you find is that the decline in patent applications is mainly China. If we could go to the next slide, please. To the next slide, please. Yes. So if you look, you see that China applications went down by 9%. Now, what's going on there? Because we all know that the Chinese economy has been booming, and Chinese performance in science and technology has been rising very, very rapidly. Well, what's going on there really is a change in the pattern of filing. A similar thing happened with Japan, but in the in the early 2000s. They went from a position of filing a large number of domestic applications, so a lot of domestic applications, to focusing on quality and international applications. And the consequence in Japan is that for over a period of about 10 years, from about 2010, 2005, 2010, the number of domestic applications went down, but the number of international applications coming out of Japan went up. And I think that's what's happening in China. So one can note that the volume in China is quite incredible. 1.4 million. And you look at the United States of America, a powerhouse in science and technology, 600,000. So it's extraordinary. And in Japan, 300,000. In fact, the number of applications in China is equivalent to the total of the next 4 countries. So it's an extraordinary number, and we'll come back to that in just one moment, but a change in the pattern of filing and a greater emphasis on export markets, international protection for Chinese enterprises. And I think this is what's happening there. So the next slide, please. Look, you can study that. I won't go through it. It just gives you an aggregate of all intellectual property applications, who's filing the most in the world for the top 20 filing countries. And it's quite interesting to study that. I won't go on. The next slide, please. Now I'd like to turn away from demand, where we see those patterns that I've described, and look a little at the changing geography of intellectual property. Geopolitical shift, if you like. Now, again, I think all of you will be familiar with what I'm about to say. Nevertheless, it is such a profound shift that I think we need to emphasize it. You know, the shift. So I think, you know, historically, being rather crude about it, what we see is that from, you know, well, you could go back, and of course you can go back to the great Arab caliphats of the, you know, the 9th, 10th century, 10th, 11th century, great centers of learning and science and technology, Baghdad and others. But let me start roughly the Renaissance, and we see that science and technology was dominated really by the Europeans, Europe, for several hundred years. And of course, a lot was going on in China, but it was not interconnected with the rest of the world. A lot was going on in India too. But it was dominated by Europe for several centuries. Now, of course, at the end of the 19th century, we saw the rise of the United States of America as an industrial power, and the 20th century was the United States was a dominant factor in science and technology, very dominant, and particularly from the 1950s onwards. And of course, this is changing. You had, first of all, the arrival of Japan, and then you have the arrival of China. So Japan, roughly in the 1980s, you know, this is a process over decades, but roughly in the 1980s, rising to great prominence. And China, 1990s, 2000s really. And so what we see is that the old world of science, technology, and innovation and intellectual property, which was for a long period of history dominated by Europe and then Europe and North America, has become multipolar. And Asia in particular has risen. Now, when we unpack Asia, which of course has various definitions going from Western Asia to Southeast Asia, it's a big definition. And when we unpack it, we see that, of course, the dominant players at the moment in science and technology and innovation are Japan, China, and the Republic of Korea. But others are rising. And you can see it in some of the statistics that I'll show briefly, but leave with you in areas, for example, science and publications in science and technology. But what we have is a situation where you see there that 10 years ago, merely in 2009, Asia, for the first time, accounted for more than 50% of all patent applications filed worldwide. And that had risen by 2019, 10 years later, to 65% of all patent applications filed worldwide. North America decreased from 26% of the world share to 20%, and Europe from 17% to 11%. And the other figures are rather static. Now, you will see that it's similar for trademarks and it's similar for designs. So this is a very, very profound development, and it's the rise of a much more intensive competition in science, technology, and innovation worldwide. It's no longer a situation dominated by Europe and North America. It is a multipolar, intense competition in science, technology, and innovation that we see worldwide. And this is involving various poles: Europe, North America, Asia, in this big description that I've given of Asia. What accounts for this? I think, of course, that the cat is out of the bag, as we say in English. I'm sorry. The secret is out. Science, technology, and innovation are enormous contributors to growth in GDP over the long term. They are what gives an enterprise competitive advantage, and intellectual property protects that competitive advantage that is conferred by innovation. And this is no longer a secret. This is well known, I think, and there is great investment going on in research and development around the world, and great competition, intensive competition across a changing landscape. Now, a final point perhaps to make in this regard is, do we consider this to be the decline of the United States of America and the decline of Europe? I would say no as an answer to that. I would see it, the United States of America is still the powerhouse of science and technology in the world, and European science and technology is extremely strong. I would see it rather as the rise of a new player, and the rise, as I've said, of multipolar competition in science, technology, and innovation. So let's move, please, to the next slide. Now, you have a similar situation for trademarks. Let's not go into it. I'll leave it with you to look at if you like. And the next slide, please. That's an interesting slide. I'll just pause on that one moment. It shows that the demand in the area of trademarks is different from patents. Patents tends to be dominated by the older players, Trademarks, you see a lot of rise in middle-income countries and even lower middle-income countries in demand. So trademarks, are the first entry, if you like, into the world of intellectual property. The next slide, please. That will show you a similar picture for designs. And then if we could go to the next slide, and I'll leave demand. But I'd just like to give you quickly some figures on what's happening in the activity that gives rise to intellectual property applications. So, and these all are just confirmation of what we see as the pattern of geopolitical shift in respect of intellectual property, because intellectual property comes at the end of course, a long process which starts with science and technology and investment in research and development. But there you see the same picture, basically, for shares in worldwide research and development expenditures. You see over a period of 7 or so years, 17 years, going from the year 2000 to 2017, the United States of America declining in share, not in absolute terms, in share of world. Asia rising, EU declining, and the rest of the world rising a little. The next slide, please. The next slide, please. And there you will see a similar pattern, but it's not quite so evident in science and engineering articles, peer-reviewed science and engineering articles, with an increasing, portion of those being published in, well, the rest of the world, but China in particular over that period of 18 or so years. China is the purple patch in this. Again, confirmation of the same trend. The next slide, please. And often people say, I've included this one because often people will say, oh yes, but it's all just numbers, what about quality? Well, the fact is we don't have a metric for patent quality. Of course, it goes through the process of examination at the patent office, but we don't really have a metric. If we did have such a metric, well, you wouldn't need a venture capital industry. People would be able to say what is going to take off in the market. But we don't have that. However, this is quite an interesting slide because it gives an indication of the top 1% of science and engineering articles cited, the number of citations of an article around the world. And you see that the line there for China, again, is rising. So it's an indication that more attention is focused on Chinese science and engineering articles and publications. And, one could say that's an indication of the quality of those. Same with Japan, and the same with India to some extent, it's rising. So let's move on from that. And I'd like to leave then this world of, huge volume of intellectual property applications, something extraordinary, volumes, numbers of applications worldwide, more than doubling, across a period of 10 years, and taking off in the long term. And this huge geopolitical shift, which, as I said, I think is, we cannot overemphasize the importance of that. So what's all this mean? And I'd like to look at, well, perhaps if you forgive me, let me go back one and deal with, not necessarily the slide, but deal with one point for which I don't have slides, which is of the persistent trends that I mentioned at the outset. I mentioned volume or demand, geographical, geopolitical shift, and the third one is complexity. And I'd like to pause on that a bit, because all of this demand for intellectual property, this attention focus on science, technology, innovation, and then intellectual property, it has brought about a much more complex world for all professionals operating in the field of intellectual property. And you can see that in two main ways. First, the architecture of intellectual property regulation has become much more complex. So if you went back to the 1980s, you had one institution operating internationally, and that was the World Intellectual Property Organization. And then you had mainly activity at the national level, and not much in between. Now, if you fast forward 30 years, 40 years from 1980, what you see is a much more complex architecture, because you have not just the World Intellectual Property Organization operating at the international or multilateral level, but you also have the World Trade Organization with the TRIPS agreement coming online in 1994. And you have a lot of other organizations concerned about intellectual property, for example, the World Health Organization. But not just the World Health Organization, the International Telecommunications Union. Everyone's concerned about this because of the dominance of science and technology. And so you have a more complex situation at the international level. Then you have quite a lot of regional activity. Think in terms of the European Union and the number of regulations and directives that it puts out in the field of intellectual property. It's very active, but it's not alone. And then you have a lot of plurilateral arrangements, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has a new name now, such as the Canada, Mexico, United States Free Trade Agreement. You have the new Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, for a number of Asian countries, in which the intellectual property provisions constitute 24% of the text. 1/4 just about of the text is on intellectual property. So you have all of that. And then you have bilateral free trade agreements. So this is a very complex field architecture for the regulation of intellectual property, and for professionals operating in the area, it makes life more difficult. Also for enterprises. Think in terms of compliance for an enterprise with the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, of the European Union. If you want to operate in the European Union, you have to comply basically with that. And if you comply with it for a market as large as Europe, about 360 million people, then you might as well have your systems complying with it worldwide, because how do you know where this is going to be operating? So complexity. And then you have another form of complexity that has arisen, which is the complexity that science is, and technology and technological advances are introducing into the subject matter of intellectual property. Now think in terms of artificial intelligence and some of the questions arising in that regard. And I'll try to come back to that, because this is a profound challenge for intellectual property to remain fit for purpose in a world of changing technologies. So complexity, I think, is another of the persistent trends that we have to bear in mind. Now let's go, please, the next slide, to the consequences and some of the consequences of these persistent trends. First, let's look at IP administration, the IP offices worldwide. Well, we do see, and we will see, great use of information technology systems and artificial intelligence. Now, look in terms of, let me give you one example, trademarks. So there are about 55 million trademarks registered around the world. And the volume of new applications each year is about 11 million. Depends on how you count them. If you count them by classes, in the trademark classification, it's 15 million. But applications, about 11 million new applications worldwide. Now, if you are the owner of, let's say, the Mercedes symbol, as an example, the trademark for the Mercedes symbol. The task of just looking at the new applications, 11 million applications a year, to see whether there's a potentially infringing application coming up worldwide, because they operate globally, it's just about humanly impossible. And the same for a trademark office. If you've got to compare a figurative mark with the 55 million registrations that exist already around the world and the 11 million new ones coming on, it's just about humanly impossible. But artificial intelligence-based system can do this in about 2 seconds and returns very good results. So I always think that technology doesn't just spring out of anywhere. Technology is driven by needs, and the needs created by volume and complexity are drivers of artificial intelligence. So I think that we need to bear this in mind, that the world for the administration of intellectual property is changing. You have already artificial intelligence-based systems for image searching, for language and translation. Think of the consequence of geopolitical shift. Over 50% of the new patent applications worldwide are written in Chinese, Japanese, or Korean. It lends itself to the classification work, and a lot of work is going on around the world for applying AI to search systems. Now, behind this lies, I think, a deeper point, which is that the old world of 100 years or so, 120 years of intellectual property internationally was dominated by treaties and the process of coming together and making rules and harmonizing rules around the world. I think the new world is going to be dominated by systems and interconnecting systems. So you can achieve more uniformity, less likely through a treaty because it's politically contentious and difficult, and more likely through having similar systems. And I think that's a trend that we will see. And then finally, I think for IP administrations, for 100 years or so, they were left alone to do their work. And now, of course, science, technology, innovation brings them into contact and brings other regulatory agencies into contact with the world of intellectual property, competition authorities, health authorities, environment, trade, security, and so on. And well, it's a challenge for administrations around the world to ensure compatibility and uniformity of the different strategic goals of each area. So let's move to the next slide, please. Now, the next slide, please. Now, for the intellectual property profession, and here I address in particular those of you who are lawyers and patent attorneys and trademark attorneys and so on, what do these consequences that we see in the field of intellectual property mean? Well, I think that it pushes you, if I may say, to the higher value contribution. So the old world was one in which essentially the business was filing applications. And then the application was there and the protection was there. Now there's so much attention focused on this area, and the competition is so intense that a lot of the action has moved from that pre-grant stage, the filing stage, where we will see increasing involvement of systems, IT systems and AI systems, to post-grant management of intellectual property portfolios, where you have licensing and collaboration as major factors, litigation, and advisory work for enterprises that have intellectual assets in dealing with a very complex architecture and also dealing with some of the social tensions arising out of innovation, the tensions we've seen around digital platforms recently, the tensions we've seen around health and access, and the vaccines debate that's going on worldwide now. So the nature, I think, of the work ultimately of the profession is being pushed by these developments from the pre-grant stage of the filing being the most important activity to the post-grant management stage. Of course, this has a very differential impact across the world. And what I speak about is a longer term trend, and a trend that I think you will see, or we see most pronounced in the so-called advanced technological economies, and lesser advanced. So if you go to some of the LDCs in the world, the least developed countries in the world, you'll see that the action is very much not just on the filing. Whatever action there is on filing. It's not on this, you know, a high value, highly technological based interaction that you get in the knowledge economy. And I think a final point, but I'll come back to it, to say for the profession is that we will see to some extent, or are seeing to some extent, a deformalization of intellectual property rights. Let me leave that aside and I'll come back to it. So the next slide, please. Right, so now this is really, you know, future gazing. And as they say, only a fool would make predictions, especially about the future. But here are some of the, I think, consequences that we're going to see in terms of the social tensions around intellectual property. The first thing I would mention is what's called O'Mara's Law. And that's really a warning for me in what I'm going to say. O'Mara's Law is that we tend to overestimate the short-term effects of technological advances, and we underestimate the long-term effects. And the classic example is given, is nanotechnology, that we, you know, speak it up in the short term, but in fact, it's a technology that requires quite a bit of time to come online. And when we don't get the exact response that corresponds to the degree of optimism that there is about the new technology in the short term, we underestimate that actually it's maturing and it's going to have a big impact. So it's very difficult to forecast technology, that is to say. But I think one of the big questions that's being thrown up by all of these developments is the fitness of purpose of the intellectual property regime in the digital age. And that's a big question. And I can't go into it in full detail. It's really the subject of, you know, a full presentation on its own. But just a couple of points perhaps to make. I think, you know, well, there are historical antecedents for intellectual property that go right back in time, you know, even to the 7th century before the current era, where you see the ancient Greeks and the Sybarites, you know, having a form of intellectual property. So there are many, but really, I think intellectual property started to become a major feature with the Industrial Revolution. And why? Well, because when you have manufacture that is artisan manufacture, the importance is placed in the individual physical item that is produced by the artisan. When you have mass production, the importance is not in the item that is mass produced, the same item, but in the technology that enables the mass production. And thus, I think the Industrial Revolution really was the birth of the modern IP system that we see at the moment. Now we have the digital transformation, digital revolution, whatever term you would like to apply to the current developments that we are witnessing. And by the way, I think it's very difficult to, describe them accurately. But whatever is happening, and a lot is happening, it's challenging that regime of intellectual property that was really designed for a different form of technology, namely industrial technology. And we've seen this play out in many respects. I mean, think in terms of music, to delve into copyright for one moment. We've seen a complete revolution in the way in which music is produced, distributed, and consumed across the world in the last 20 years. You go back to the 1990s, it was a world of CD-ROMs for music. But now it's a world largely of streaming. Now, the fundamental institution of copyright in returning value to the author or the creator remains the basic economic model for all of this, because if you want to sell anything, of course, you have to have a property right on which to base your claim for sales. And the same for advertising, by the way. You get the advertising only if you've got a property right to justify, your right to ask for a portion of the advertising revenue. But so copyright is held up, but the change that has occurred was driven really by changing business models. And the business model of streaming proved to be more or less the most successful in being able to lower costs, broaden distribution. And that's a very interesting, play that you have, which shows us that, you can't just throw out the old intellectual property system, but a great deal of adaptation is needed and will be required. Now, think in terms of artificial intelligence. There are many questions that arise here for the intellectual property regime, and we are far from having answers. I could give you one example, which is, can you, as the developer of an algorithm, an artificial intelligence algorithm, can you feed the algorithm copyrighted data, or is it an infringement of copyright? So can I take the repertoire of music of Sony Music, for example, and feed it to an algorithm in order to develop artificial intelligence based or generated music? Or is that an infringement of Sony's copyright? Well, it's an open question, actually. I mean, there is a technical analysis that's required. Is the algorithm copying, or is it just learning from the data? That's a technical approach. There is a policy approach, and the policy approach is complicated because on the one hand, you have the claim of the copyright owner and the investment that's gone into developing that repertoire of music. But on the other hand, you have a strong movement in science, in particular, for the free flow of data. And it's not just science, it's also government responses. They would like the free flow of data to encourage innovation, particularly in the field of artificial intelligence. So there are many questions that are of fundamental nature that are being posed by the digital transformation. And one of those, of course, is the status of data. And again, data, I think, it requires a separate analysis. And I personally think we're a long way from understanding what the appropriate policy framework for data should be. And it's very complicated because it's a policy thicket. You have considerations of privacy, you have considerations of competition law that we see playing out with the platforms around the world right at the moment. You have considerations of cybersecurity. You have considerations of the integrity of data, false information, disinformation, being put out deliberately. You have questions also of property. Whose data is it? Now think in terms of medical data. If you go along to a doctor the interaction causes the generation of certain data. To whom do those data belong? Do they belong to the patient? Do they belong to the doctor, the hospital? What use can be made of them? And the answer to that is that nobody is really sure, frankly. And lawyers that I know operating in some places where like Boston, where the biosciences are extremely prominent, they tell me that they're making it up. Basically, they're making up the law as they go. And a lot is being done on the basis of contract. You contract, and you get consent and so on in the contract. So this is what I referred to earlier as the deformalization of intellectual property rights, brought about by data and the importance of data in the current economy. Look, we're a long way from understanding this, in my view. Perhaps I'm just slow, but I think we're a long way from understanding it. It's an urgent problem, but it's also extremely difficult and complex problem. And it's not really just a national problem, it's an international problem, but you have this intersection of so many different policies that it's very difficult for progress to be made. So I think data is an area to keep our eye on in the future and to think about. This deformalization of the system means that a certain greater emphasis is placed on trade secrecy. Why is that happening? Well, because a lot of data is generated, think in terms of the life sciences, a lot of data is generated which is pre-invention. The data's there, but the value has not yet been found in the data. However, the data are valuable because they are the basis on which a scientific exploration and thinking and experimentation will be done. So the only real way of protecting it these days, this pre-invention data, before the data becomes an invention in some form, is trade secrecy. So this is one big driver of trade secret protection. There are other drivers. And then let me just say as a last point that I think we're starting to see around the world, it's not strong at the moment, but it's happening, I think, calls for responsible innovation. Now, that's a very difficult question. Responsible innovation, what they mean is, well, should we put all this money into developing TikTok or, Facebook or any of these other social media platforms that have been developed, or should we be trying to direct the investment in science and technology and innovation into more basic, fundamental science that is going to have a real impact on the social challenges that we face in the world today? So this movement towards responsible innovation, I think, has started, and I think we'll hear more of it in the future. Could we go to the next slide, please? Now for the regulatory, the consequences for the regulatory or policy environment. Well, look, I've spoken a bit about this, but I think we need to, bear it in mind that everyone's going to be involved now with intellectual property. So we need to get used to this, that we're not left alone anymore. We have, as a consequence, a basic, debate about how important the innovation incentives are, that's intellectual property, as against the trade-offs and the competing interests, such as access. I mean, this is most clear in the field of medicine. You need to have incentives for the enormous investment that goes into medical and biomedical research these days. Otherwise, no one will do it. But on the other hand, you know, why do we have innovations in the field of health? Well, so that people can enjoy them. So it's a trade-off, and I think the only answer to it is balance. I don't think it's one side or the other. I think it's getting the right balance and getting that balance in such a way that you do have a healthy innovation incentive, but you also have the possibility for the social enjoyment of the benefit of the innovation. Now, another thing I think that we need to bear in mind in the regulatory policy environment, particularly at the international level, is you know, the possibility of the balkanization of the world. So this is really playing out at the moment, and I think this will continue to play out. And it's a complex subject, and I can't deal with it again in huge detail in this time frame, because this is really just an overview. But what you see with the strategic competition between the United States of America and China is the possibility of, you know, different sectors in the world developing. Now, of course, this is a very sensitive political subject, but it shouldn't stop us being aware. You know, in international relations, one of the first things that I was taught, at any rate, is the African dictum that when two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets hurt. So, you know, we need to watch this space because a lot is happening in it. And the consequences for the rest of the world are extremely important. So there's talk of the splinter net, the internet being divided up, of separate markets. And I could back this up with a lot of documentation and a lot of thinking that's going on in the various world. We have the decoupling movement of the last several years, deglobalization to some extent. So this, I think, is something we need to keep our eye on because the world of intellectual property has been a world basically that has been internationalized. And through mainly WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, there's quite a sophisticated structure of international agreements. Now, will that prevail? Or will we see different groupings? Now, to some extent, we are seeing the different groupings through all of the trade arrangements to which I made reference earlier, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia, and you've got many of them all around the world. So you are seeing these different grouping, and a lot more action at that level than the international level in some respects. I think this is something we need to reflect on and think about. It's extremely important development, and it's not going to go away. If I can cite an example, just one example, but there are many, you know, and they range from official policy papers and positions through to more informal ones. The one I'm going to cite is an informal one. There is a group in the United States called the China Strategy Group, and it's co-chaired by Eric Schmidt, who was the former CEO of Google, and it's got some very prominent business persons in the United States involved. They published a report in the fall of last year, 2020, called Asymmetric Competition, a policy for US-China competition, technology competition, or competition in the field of technology. Now, they make an analysis and they make a number of recommendations. And one of the recommendations is forming a T12 T for technology and 12 for 12 countries. Now that has no status, that recommendation. It's a recommendation of a group of private but very influential business persons. I cite it as an indication of the sort of thinking that is going on in the world and the regroupings that could occur in the field of technology. And it happens at a time when multilateralism in its classical sense of full international involvement is under severe challenge for a lot of reasons, which again is the subject of a lecture on its own or a presentation on its own. And so that's a space, I think, to watch and what this might do to intellectual property protection. Now, the deformalization of IP rights, I think I've said enough of that. So let's go to the next slide, if we may. Here, but overall, what we've seen in the course of the last couple of years is a closure. Now, that has happened for political reasons. I mentioned the decoupling, the strategic competition between the world's two biggest economies, but you see other signs of closure. Foreign direct investment has been dramatically down, and this was pre-COVID. Protectionism is up. Scrutiny of foreign investment, proposals on the grounds of critical infrastructure or national security has tightened considerably, and not just in the United States of America, but also in Europe and other countries around the world. You also have a technological impact of closing, because you have advanced manufacturing and robotics and artificial intelligence replacing labor to some extent, and leading to a situation in which some enterprises are now able to manufacture with the use of robotics and advanced manufacturing to replace low-cost labor centers, which leads to a reconfiguration of global value chains across the world. And these forces for closure, well, let's see, we have a new administration in the United States of America is going to have a different attitude to things. We also have President Xi Jinping of China, giving in the last days a speech at the Davos Forum, in which he's pleading for openness. So, this is an area we need to watch as well. I think in all of that, it's interesting that those movements for closure are very much in contrast to the nature of the technology, which is opening. It's for interconnection and openness and collaboration around the world. So we have a slight collision there, of course. And in this, of course, we have to keep in mind the huge technological divide that exists in the world, and which is really, in my view, the basis of, the division in the world. If you look at the amount invested in research and development by the United States and China, to take two examples, United States, it's around about 540 billion United States dollars. China, it was around about 480 billion United States dollars. That's more than the GDP of 167 countries in the world. So this, I don't think you can overestimate the technological divide that is occurring in the world, and with the speed of technological change, this is being exacerbated. And the final point I think we need to bear in mind is that, the public has, in some respects, ambivalent attitudes towards technology. On the one hand, they like it. And on the other hand, they're very suspicious of it. So there's always this possibility lurking in the background of backlash against technology, which I think those of us involved in the world of technology need to be very careful of. Now, if we could go to the next slide, please. And I come to the last part, and I'm sorry to have spoken for so long, but let me deal with some of the challenges for intellectual property and the world of intellectual property. And I think, well, those of us involved in the intellectual property world, for all of the reasons that I've cited, we have to be conscious of the cost of our services and the public image of intellectual property. This applies particularly for startups and small and medium enterprises. You know, it's very often a startup might have as its seeking protection at a stage in which it has really no funding. Small and medium enterprises face similar problems of access to the intellectual property system and funding and financing. So I think we need to bear this in mind, that we are in a world in which the spotlight is on intellectual property. And I think similarly, we need to bear in mind that we should not overcomplicate the system. So particularly in the IT area, you see that technology and product life cycles, they're very short, and our regulatory cycle of examining a patent application might be up to 4 years. Well, the technology's come and gone in between time, so we have to try to bring those closer together. And the reversion to informal protection mechanisms is something that decreases the transparency of the system. We need to watch that as well. And finally, I'd say, you know, this big question of the fitness for purpose of the intellectual property system in the digital age. And in particular, the urgency, but complexity and difficulty surrounding development of data policies at the government level and the development of data policies at the corporate level for corporations. So I think we're not short of challenges. There's going to be plenty of work in the future. And perhaps I'll stop my remarks at that point. And thank you for your patience. And very happy to interact with you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Francis. Thank you for all these valuable informations. And now, everyone, if you have any question, please raise your hand or write it in the chat section, and we will answer it to you. And for those people who are asking about the recording, yes, we are recording this lecture, and you can find it in YouTube in SIPE channel later on. So please, if you have any question, just raise your hand or write it in the chat section, and we will answer all your questions. Feel free to ask any question you want. Dr. Francis, can you open the chat section, and maybe if you have if you see the question, you can answer it, or do you want me to read it for you?
It's fine. I've got one from S. Shaya.
Yes.
Yes. For AI development, to what extent you see the language and translation problem will be solved for example, WIPO? Yeah. Look, great question. And of course, well, first of all, you need a good, what they call corpus, you know, body of data. And WIPO is very well placed in this respect because it's got the Patent Cooperation Treaty in which you can publish in 10 languages. You know, the official UN languages of English, French, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian, plus German, Japanese, Korean, and Portuguese. So that develops a good corpus of very pertinent data for the algorithms to work on. And I think great progress has been made, great progress. So I think we're at the stage where AI can tell you whether you need a translation. So it can tell you quite quickly, is this patent application interesting? And again, I think the impact on labor, if you like, is to push labor to a higher value. So translators use these systems and it saves them some work. But you'd still need the revision of the translator and a skilled input of the translator. So I don't think that you will see in the near future the full replacement of translation by AI, but productivity of translators will be improved by AI systems. The general public and industry's capacity to be able to deal with the volume of applications coming out in foreign languages will be helped, and they'll know whether they need to examine and get a good translation of a particular application. And in certain areas, for example, let me take the area of trademarks. Well, I think you will see AI largely replacing translation for the list of goods and services, because that can be done relatively easily. There'll need to be a revision, but I think that'll be the major impact. In the patent area, it won't be as quick. So I hope this helps in responding to that very pertinent question. So what are my thoughts on the continuous extension of copyright items? Yeah, e.g. Disney, the Mickey Mouse rule, extending from 50 to 70 years after the life of the author, the term of protection. Well, it's a great question. And it's a complicated one, I think, because on the one hand, you have the speed of the technology life cycles in the digital area, which is, very at a very high level, so that, do you need copyright protection on a computer program that was manufactured in it was developed in the 1980s? Still, probably not, because no one, not many of them will be being used still, except for certain mainframes and programs and so on. But on the other hand, when you have an author, an individual creator, of course, one work can be extremely important for the person. One author's book, a particularly good book or successful book, or one creator's or musician's recording or composition. So they do need to be able to get a decent return over a significant period of time. However, all of that said, I think we come back to a question of balance once again. What is the appropriate balance to ensure some incentives for the cultural world on the one hand, but on the other hand, to ensure that the reason why we have all this is so that people can enjoy it. So access, so the balance between those two, it's a question of balance. I don't have a particular answer. I think for this balance question, I don't think there's any one answer that you can give across all fields. I think that we're going to have to find socially the balance again and again and again in different situations. So that's the way I would look at it there. Difficult question. I haven't given you a good answer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Francis. Thank you all for joining us in such an insightful lecture. A special thank to Dr. Francis and our national partnerships and to all the participants. Thank you so much. Before we end the meeting, the lecture, I want to say that we will send to everyone who attend this lecture an evaluation form. Please fill the form and send them back to us. And by the end of next week, we will send the certificate to all those for those people who attend the lecture. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for Dr. Francis.
My pleasure. Would you like me to address the last two questions that just came up?
Of course, whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So I've lost one of them on my screen, which was about educational materials. So I can't see the exact question anymore, but just to address that area of educational materials. Yeah, it's a recognized exception in many countries around the world. But the recognized exception is not that you can just freely copy, but that you can take excerpts and use them. Well, a lot is happening in that area of education. I think it's a very complex area, and particularly as a result of the lockdowns associated with COVID pandemic. So I think that what we're seeing generally is that educational materials are increasingly moving towards databases. In the publishing world, I think the book, as we've always known it, is standing up quite well in the area of what they call in the publishing world trade, which is actually novels and stories. But in the educational world, which is the largest segment of the publishing world, there's increasing movement from textbooks to platforms or databases. And so I think we'll see there more and more reliance on a subscription model and less reliance on the individual item of the textbook as a general development. Again, a world in transformation, it's a difficult, balance to strike, particularly as the publishing industry feels that it's bearing the brunt of this change in technology. Now, let me go to the other question, if I may. Lots of different concepts and standards of intellectual property fields here. Global harmonization could be done. Look, harmonization became a dirty word in the 1990s. And that largely, I think, was because you had the TRIPS agreement enacted in 1994, coming into force in 1994. And TRIPS agreement was a very comprehensive set of regulations, and many developing countries felt that they were not fully familiar with intellectual property and the importance of intellectual property when this agreement was negotiated. And there was a bit of a backlash against it and a bit of a backlash against harmonization, because they held the view that harmonization was meaning harmonization to the highest standard in the world, which wouldn't necessarily apply to their economies. So I think we saw a big backlash against harmonization from in the 90s, the early 2000s, and so on. That said, in an interconnected world, we can't live without certain standards. Everyone would like their mobile telephone to work when they get off the plane, when you can catch a plane, when they get off the plane in a different country. And that can only happen through certain standardization processes. So for business operating in global markets, there needs to be a certain standardization of rules. So again, a balance question. You have certain developing countries saying, yeah, but look, and this tends to be the international consensus at the moment, health, environment, and agriculture are three areas that where we can see the primacy of national policies over international policies. In other areas, perhaps international policies are more dominant. It's going to remain controversial. And I think that it's very difficult to get harmonization. And what we have to do is to proceed, I think, from the procedural harmonization, which I think helps business and startups to navigate a very complex world. Start with the procedural harmonization, the substantive harmonization, that's long discussions which involve fundamental strategic competitive interests on the part of economies, and it's a difficult discussion. Okay, well, look, it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to interact with you. Thank you so much,
Thank you, Dr.
look forward to another engagement.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.